The shadows of 1920s Chicago held many secrets, but none quite like the mastermind who hid behind the humble byline of the Morning Herald's crime beat. When dangerous men threatened the city's last honest newspaper, they had no idea they were challenging someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of becoming anyone, anywhere, anytime. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain fell in sheets across Chicago's newspaper row, turning cobblestones slick and washing away the day's grime. Through the misted windows of the Morning Herald's offices, Daniel Chase methodically arranged his desk with the same precise attention he'd given it for the past 5 years. His wire-rimmed glasses kept slipping down his nose as he sorted through the evening's assignments, each movement deliberate and unremarkable. The Herald's evening office hummed with the familiar chorus of typewriters and printing presses, the last honest paper in Chicago, working overtime to meet its morning deadline. While other publications had fallen to mob influence or political pressure, the Herald remained stubbornly independent, a fact that was becoming increasingly dangerous in a city where truth carried a price tag. Chase's desk sat in the corner of the bustling newsroom, positioned to observe without drawing attention. His articles, mostly minor crime reports and city council coverage, never made the front page. His colleagues viewed him as reliable, if unremarkable, the kind of reporter who would never break a major story but could be counted on to fill column inches with clean copy. Tonight, however, something shifted in the newsroom's usual rhythm. 3 men, in expensive suits that couldn't quite hide their crude nature, sauntered through the office entrance, their presence immediately drawing nervous glances from the evening staff. Chase recognized their type immediately. Enforcers for the Callahan Syndicate, one of the city's most powerful criminal organizations. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a face that suggested intimate familiarity with violence, made straight for the editor's office. Through the glass partition, Chase watched as Herbert Wallace, the Herald's aging editor, received his unwelcome visitors with visible apprehension. "Evening, friend," the lead enforcer's voice carried across the suddenly quiet newsroom. "Mr. Callahan sends his regards and a friendly suggestion about tomorrow's headline." He dropped a thick envelope on Wallace's desk, its contents obvious. To everyone watching, Wallace's response was quiet but firm. "The Herald reports news, not advertisements. If Mr. Callahan wants to purchase space, our rates are listed on the back page." The enforcer's smile never reached his eyes. "Maybe you misunderstand. This isn't about advertising. It's about your paper's unfortunate habit of printing stories that upset certain business arrangements. Mr. Callahan's offering to help you understand which stories deserve special consideration." Chase's hands never paused in their methodical organization of papers, though anyone watching closely might have noticed how his fingers lingered near certain desk drawers. His unremarkable appearance, from his slightly rumpled suit to his thinning brown hair, seemed designed to fade into the background, allowing him to observe without being observed. The lead enforcer continued his monologue, his voice carrying just enough threat to make several reporters suddenly remember urgent assignments elsewhere. "Like that piece you're planning about the warehouse fire on Michigan Avenue. Tragic accident, wasn't it? Be a shame if someone started looking too closely at the insurance angle." Wallace's face paled slightly, but his voice remained steady. "We report facts, Mr. Sullivan, James Sullivan, and facts can be dangerous things in this city, especially for aging newspapermen with families." Sullivan leaned forward, his expensive suit stretching across broad shoulders. "I hear your granddaughter just started at St. Mary's School. Beautiful building, isn't it? Would be tragic if something happened to it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Chase adjusted his glasses, a gesture that somehow made him appear even more harmless. But beneath his desk, his free hand moved with practiced precision, activating a carefully concealed recording device, one of many innovations he'd developed over years of gathering evidence against men who thought themselves untouchable. "Thing about facts," Sullivan continued, clearly enjoying the editor's discomfort, "is that they're more flexible than most people think. Take the Chronicle across town. They understand how to present stories in ways that benefit everyone. Their editor just bought a lovely summer house in Wisconsin. Amazing what the right perspective can do for a man's career." Wallace's reply was interrupted by the arrival of more visitors. Two police detectives entered the newsroom, their badges catching the evening light. Detective Michael Ryan, whose reputation for integrity made him increasingly rare in Chicago's compromised police force, nodded briefly to Wallace. "Evening, Herb," Ryan called out, his voice carrying deliberate casualness. "Thought I'd drop by, see if you needed any clarification on that warehouse story." Sullivan's friendly demeanor shifted slightly, though his smile remained fixed. "Just having a business discussion here, Detective. Nothing that concerns the police." Ryan's response was mild, but his eyes never left Sullivan. "Funny coincidence. We've been having lots of business discussions lately, especially about newspaper offices that receive unexpected visitors after hours." Chase observed this exchange. With practiced detachment, his unremarkable presence allowing him to note every detail, the way Sullivan's companions had positioned themselves near the exits, how their coat pockets hung heavy with concealed weapons, the subtle signals they exchanged. But most importantly, he noticed what others missed, the slight tremor in Wallace's hand as he gripped his desk, the kind of fear that went beyond simple intimidation. Wallace had received other visitors recently, Chase realized. This wasn't the first threat, just the most public. The editor was hiding something, protecting some piece of information that made him valuable enough to threaten, but too dangerous to eliminate openly. Sullivan finally straightened, adjusting his cuffs with exaggerated care. "We'll continue this discussion later, Mr. Wallace. When there's less," he glanced at the detectives, "official interest in your business affairs." As the enforcers departed, Chase caught Ryan's questioning look toward Wallace. The editor gave a slight shake of his head. Some conversations were best held away from prying ears, but Chase had already begun calculating, analyzing patterns that others missed. The warehouse fire, Wallace's sudden anxiety, Sullivan's specific threats. Pieces of a larger puzzle were starting to align. 5 years of playing the forgettable reporter had taught Chase patience. His carefully crafted persona, the mild-mannered journalist who never quite managed to break a major story, had allowed him to observe Chicago's power players without drawing attention. But beneath this unremarkable exterior lay a mind that had mastered the art of disguise and deception long before he'd ever touched a typewriter. As the evening staff began to depart, Chase maintained his methodical organization, his movements designed to reinforce his image of harmless efficiency. But his mind was already working through preparations and possibilities. Something significant was building in Chicago's shadows, something that connected warehouse fires to mob enforcers, to threatened editors. The rain continued to fall outside the Herald's windows, washing away surface grime but leaving deeper corruptions untouched. But Daniel Chase had spent years preparing for moments like this, building an arsenal of disguises and identities that would let him explore Chicago's darkest corners. Soon, James Sullivan and his employers would learn why the city's most dangerous investigator was the one they never noticed at all. The office gradually emptied, leaving Chase alone with the steady rhythm of the printing presses in the basement below. Only then did he allow his carefully maintained facade to shift slightly, his movements becoming more precise as he retrieved a small, leather-bound notebook from a hidden compartment in his desk. The notebook's pages contained more than just the reporter's notes. Detailed sketches of faces and clothing filled the margins, along with chemical formulas for various theatrical makeup and costume materials. Chase had spent years perfecting these techniques, learning how to transform not just his appearance, but his entire presence. Each disguise was a carefully crafted performance supported by extensive research and preparation. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of heels on hardwood. Margaret Shaw, the Herald Society columnist, emerged from between the towering file cabinets. Unlike Chase's cultivated mediocrity, Margaret embraced visibility. Her sharp wit and sharper pen had made her both celebrated and feared in Chicago's high society circles. "They're getting bolder," Margaret observed, perching on the edge of Chase's desk. "Sullivan showing up here in person? That's not just a warning. It's a message to every newspaper in the city." Chase's response was measured, his voice maintaining its usual mild tone. "Did you notice anything interesting about our visitors?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. She was one of the few who had glimpsed beneath Chase's carefully constructed persona, though even she didn't know the full extent of his capabilities. Sullivan's suit was new, but his shoes were expensive and well-worn, old money trying to look like new, and his accent slipped when he got angry. There was something Eastern European underneath. "Very good," Chase nodded, making a note in his book. "And his companions?" The younger one was nervous, kept touching his tie. "First time on this kind of job, I'd guess, but the older one—" Margaret paused, her expression troubled. "I've seen him before at one of the mayor's fundraisers. He was with a group of legitimate businessmen who all carried police badges in their pockets." This confirmed Chase's suspicions. The warehouse fire wasn't just another insurance scam. It was part of something larger, something that connected Chicago's criminal underground to its political elite. Wallace's reaction suggested the Herald had stumbled onto evidence that threatened this delicate arrangement. "Be careful with this one, Daniel," Margaret warned, using his first name, a rarity in their professional relationship. "I've been hearing whispers about other reporters who got too curious. Thomas Kane from the Tribune disappeared last month. Official story says he took a job in New York, but his desk was left exactly as it was, the coffee cup still half full. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Chase's fingers traced the edge of his notebook. Thomas Kane had been more than just another reporter. He had been one of Chase's carefully cultivated sources, though no one knew the true extent of their connection. Kane's disappearance wasn't random. It was another piece of the puzzle, another thread in the web Chase had spent years mapping. "Margaret," Chase said quietly, his voice carrying none of its usual hesitation, "I may need to be away from the office more frequently in the coming weeks. If anyone asks, you're working on a series about city council zoning regulations." She finished with a knowing smile. "Dull enough that no one will look too closely, but important enough to justify your absence. Though I have to wonder—" She paused, studying him with newfound curiosity. "Just how many different stories are you really working on, Mr. Chase?" His response was interrupted by a commotion from the printing room. The massive presses had suddenly gone silent, an unnatural quiet in a building that lived by their rhythm. Through the office windows, Chase caught a glimpse of unfamiliar figures moving with purpose through the shadows of the press room. Margaret tensed, recognizing the implications. They're not just here to threaten anymore, are they? They're looking for something specific. Chase was already moving, his methodical demeanor giving way to fluid efficiency. From another hidden compartment, he retrieved a small camera and several sealed envelopes. "Get Wallace out through the back stairs. He'll resist, but remind him. About his granddaughter, I'll make sure our visitors stay occupied." "Daniel," Margaret caught his arm, genuine concern breaking through her usual poise. "Whatever you're planning, trust that I know exactly what I'm doing," he replied, and for just a moment his voice carried a different kind of authority, something older and more dangerous than any newspaperman should possess. "This isn't the first time I've had to ensure certain stories reach the right audiences." As Margaret hurried to the editor's office, Chase began his transformation. His wire-rimmed glasses disappeared, his posture straightened, and his entire demeanor shifted subtly. Even in the same clothes, he suddenly looked different, more substantial, more threatening. The forgettable reporter was vanishing, replaced by someone else entirely. The rain continued its relentless assault on Chicago's streets, but within the Herald's offices, a different kind of storm was brewing. In the shadows between printing presses and paper stacks, a master of disguise prepared to defend not just a newspaper, but the very principle of truth in a city drowning in lies. The silence in the printing room felt unnatural, like a held breath before a storm. Through the darkness between the massive presses, shadows moved with practiced coordination, men who knew how to search without being seen. Their footsteps, nearly silent on the ink-stained floor, spoke of professional training beyond common. Thuggery. A figure emerged from behind one of the dormant machines, but it wasn't Daniel Chase, not exactly. Though he wore the same clothes, something fundamental had shifted. His movements now carried the fluid grace of a stage performer, each step precisely calculated for maximum effect. In his hands, he held a bulky camera, its lens catching what little light remained. "Gentlemen," he called out, his voice pitched to carry, "the Herald's photography department closes at 5, but I'd be happy to arrange a group portrait for tomorrow's edition." The shadows stilled, then coalesced into 4 distinct shapes. Their leader stepped forward, not Sullivan, but someone new, taller, leaner, with the sharp features and precise bearing of military training. "You shouldn't be here," he said, each word clipped and measured. "Funny," Chase replied, adjusting his camera's settings with deliberate movements. "I was about to say the same thing, though I suspect we have different definitions of shouldn't." The tall man's hand disappeared beneath his coat. "This is a private matter between Mr. Callahan and the Herald's management. Walk away now, forget what you've seen, and perhaps we can avoid any unfortunate accidents." Chase's response was to raise his camera and take a photograph, the flash momentarily illuminating the scene in harsh white light. In that frozen instant, he captured more than just faces. He documented positions, weapons, the telling details that professional killers tried to hide. "Interesting choice of equipment," Chase observed as the afterimage faded. "That's a model. 1911 you're carrying. Military issue, not the commercial version. Recently cleaned, too. You can still smell the gun oil." The tall man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his stance. "You have a good eye. Better than most reporters." "I notice things," Chase agreed, slowly circling to keep all 4 men in view. "Like how you're positioned to cover both exits, how your men move in practiced formations, the way you automatically check sightlines and potential cover. Not the usual skills for newspaper negotiations. You're very observant, Mr. Chase, Daniel Chase. Crime beat mostly. Nothing important." His self-deprecating smile carried an edge of something sharper. "Though I did write an interesting piece last month about veterans finding unusual employment after the war, particularly those with specialized training in covert operations." The tall man's eyes narrowed slightly. "I read that article. Remarkably well-informed about certain military units that officially never existed. Research is part of the job." Chase's camera hung ready, but his attention never wavered from the men surrounding him. "Like researching why Mr. Callahan would send military professionals to search a newspaper office. What could be so valuable that it requires this level of expertise to find?" "You're asking dangerous questions, Mr. Chase." It's what reporters do. For instance, I'm curious about the timing. Why tonight? What changed? Chase's voice remained conversational, but his mind was racing through calculations and possibilities. Perhaps something was discovered in that warehouse fire, something that shouldn't have survived the flames. The tall man's reaction was subtle, just a slight tightening around the eyes. But it confirmed Chase's suspicion. The Herald had stumbled onto something far more significant than a simple insurance scam. The problem with fire, Chase continued, moving closer to one of the massive printing presses, is that it's not always thorough. Sometimes things survive that should have burned. Documents, ledgers, evidence of transactions that certain people would prefer remained private. You seem to have given this considerable thought, Mr. Chase. The tall man's voice carried a new note of evaluation. For someone who writes about petty crimes and city council meetings, professional habit. You observe, you analyze, you draw conclusions, like observing how your men have been slowly moving to cut off my escape routes. Very professional, very subtle. Chase's smile didn't reach his eyes. Almost as subtle as the way you're trying to distract me from whatever your fourth man is doing upstairs. This earned him a sharp look. The tall man hadn't mentioned a fourth operative, hadn't given any indication that their team was larger than the three visible members. It was the kind of detail that a simple crime reporter shouldn't have been able to deduce. You're either very clever, the tall man said softly, or very foolish. Coming down here alone, confronting armed men, revealing how much you've deduced. One might question your survival instincts. Chase's laugh carried genuine amusement. Who said I came alone? As if on cue, the printing presses roared to life, their sudden thunder deafening in the confined space. Emergency lights blazed, transforming the shadows that had concealed the intruders into harsh exposure. And through the cacophony of machinery, new voices could be heard, the heavy tread of multiple feet approaching from different directions. Fascinating thing about newspaper offices, Chase had to raise his voice to be heard over the presses. They're never really empty. Reporters, typesetters, printers, we work in shifts, and everyone who works here believes in protecting the truth, even if that means preparing for unexpected visitors. The tall man's professional mask cracked slightly as he realized their position had been compromised. His team was now caught between the operating presses and whatever force was approaching through the building's maze-like corridors. This isn't over, he warned, already signaling his men to fall back. Actually, Chase replied, his mild manner completely gone, it's just beginning. Tell Mr. Callahan that the Herald staff appreciates his interest in our editorial process. I'm sure he'll be fascinated by tomorrow's front page. The intruders retreated with professional efficiency, vanishing into the building's service exits before the approaching footsteps could reach them. But Chase made no move to pursue. Instead, he carefully removed the film from his camera and sealed it in a pre-addressed envelope. Margaret emerged from behind one of the presses, her expression a mix of admiration and concern. That was either brilliant or insane, possibly both. The presses started up at perfect timing, wasn't it? Chase agreed, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction, almost like someone planned it that way, calculated exactly how long it would take them to search the building, precisely when they'd reach this point. Daniel, Margaret studied him with new intensity. Who exactly did you signal to start the presses? Because I know for a fact the night shift doesn't start for another hour. His only response was an enigmatic smile as he handed her the sealed envelope. Make sure this reaches our friend at the Tribune, the one who specializes in photographic analysis. He'll know what to look for. The military man, Margaret said thoughtfully. He wasn't just here for whatever survived the warehouse fire, was he? The way he watched you, evaluated you. It was like he was solving a puzzle. Smart people are dangerous that way, Chase agreed, already beginning to shift back into his unremarkable persona. They notice patterns, make connections, start asking questions about seemingly unrelated events. Like why a simple crime reporter would know so much about military operations, or how he could recognize professional covert tactics at a glance. Chase adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, once again looking every bit the mild-mannered journalist. People see what they expect to see, Margaret. It's the greatest advantage anyone can have in this city. But as they made their way back upstairs, both knew that something fundamental had changed. The careful balance Chase had maintained for years, the forgettable reporter hiding in plain sight, had been challenged. The tall man would report back to his employers, and questions would be asked about Daniel Chase that might lead to uncomfortable answers. In the editor's office, they found Wallace staring at an open safe, his face ashen. "They took it," he whispered. While everyone was focused on the printing room, their fourth man got into the safe. They found what they were looking for. Chase's expression revealed nothing, but his mind was already racing through implications and possibilities. What exactly did they take, Herb? Documents from the warehouse. Before the fire, someone dropped off evidence about where that building's money really came from. International accounts, shipping manifests, names of people who shouldn't exist. Wallace's hands trembled slightly. "I was going to run the story next week, once we'd verified everything." "The manifests," Chase pressed, his voice carrying new urgency. "Did they list a shipping company called White Star Exports?" Wallace's sharp look was answer enough. "How did you—" But Chase was already moving, his movements carrying none of their usual hesitation. "Margaret, get those photographs developed immediately, and find everything we have on military contracts from the last 3 years, particularly anything involving private security firms." "Daniel," Margaret grabbed his arm, "what aren't you telling us? What's White Star Exports?" His response was interrupted by the distant wail of police sirens. "Not here," he said quietly. "Too many ears, too many eyes." But tomorrow's edition just became much more interesting than anyone expected. As if to emphasize his words, the printing presses below continued their thunderous rhythm, a sound that had always reminded Chase of a heartbeat. But tonight it felt more like a drum beat, calling soldiers to war. In Chicago's shadows, new players were taking the field, and the game was about to become far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The police sirens grew closer, their wailing harmony carrying a note of urgency that Chase recognized all too well. "Back door," he directed, already moving. "They'll have the front covered." "Daniel," Wallace called after him, "there's something else. The documents they took, they weren't the only copies." Chase paused, studying the editor with new interest. "Go on." The original package came with instructions, specific protocols for handling the information, military protocols. Wallace's voice dropped to barely a whisper. The kind that someone with intelligence training would recognize. This confirmed something Chase had long suspected. Thomas Kane's disappearance wasn't just about silencing a nosy reporter. He had been part of something larger, something that connected Chicago's criminal enterprises to international operations. Margaret's sharp intake of breath suggested she'd made the same connection. The warehouse fire wasn't an insurance scam at all, was it? It was about destroying evidence. But someone got there first, someone who knew what to look for, and knew exactly how to ensure the information survived. Chase agreed, his mind racing through implications. The question is, who was the real target? The Herald for receiving the documents, or Callahan's organization for trying to destroy them? The sirens had reached their block. Through the office windows, they could see police vehicles taking position around the building, their deployment suggesting this was more than a routine response to a break-in. "They're not just here about the intruders," Wallace observed grimly. "Someone called in a threat about suspicious packages in the building. They'll have the authority to search everything. Chase's expression hardened. Convenient timing, almost like someone wanted to ensure any remaining evidence would be discovered by official channels. Official channels that Callahan controls, Margaret added, her reporter's instincts catching the implications. They're trying to box us in. If we run, we look guilty. If we stay, we face questions we can't answer, Chase finished. He moved to his desk with sudden purpose, retrieving items from hidden compartments with practiced efficiency. Margaret, take the back stairs. There's a door behind the old filing cabinets that isn't on the building plans. It leads to the service tunnel under Printers Row. She raised an eyebrow. And you know how? The same way I know about the police cordon forming around the block. The same way I recognized military tactics in our recent visitors. Chase's mild manner had completely vanished, replaced by something harder and more focused. Some stories require more than just good reporting skills to uncover. Wallace watched this transformation with growing understanding. You're not just a crime reporter, are you? All these years, the unremarkable articles, the careful cultivation of mediocrity, was exactly what certain people needed to see, Chase confirmed, checking the contents of a small leather case. The best disguise isn't just about changing your appearance. It's about creating a persona so consistent, so unremarkable, that no one questions its authenticity. From outside came the sound of police entering the building, their footsteps echoing up the stairwell. Chase handed Margaret a sealed envelope different from the one containing the photographs. Get this to the address listed inside. Don't open it. Don't try to verify its contents. The person who receives it will know what to do next. His voice carried the weight of long practice, giving similar instructions. Margaret studied him with new eyes, seeing past the carefully constructed facade to something far more complex. How long have you been playing this game, Daniel? How many other unremarkable reporters are out there, watching from the shadows? His smile carried a hint of professional appreciation. Smart questions, Margaret. The kind that good reporters learn to ask, and sometimes learn to keep to themselves. The police were on their floor now. Through the frosted glass of the office doors, they could see figures moving with tactical precision. Chase's transformation continued, subtle adjustments to his posture and expression rebuilding his harmless persona. Whatever happens next, he told Wallace and Margaret quietly, remember that appearances are rarely accurate in our profession. The story people see isn't always the one being told. The office doors opened, admitting a squad of police led by a detective Chase knew well, though not in the way the police thought they knew him. Detective James Morrison, whose reputation for solving complex cases had made him both respected and feared in Chicago's underworld. Evening, folks, Morrison called out, his casual tone belied by the armed officers spreading through the office. Heard you had some excitement. Want to tell me why professional thieves would target a newspaper office? Chase adjusted his glasses. Once again the picture of a nervous reporter. Detective, thank goodness. We were just about to call the police ourselves. The most extraordinary thing happened. As Chase began spinning a carefully constructed version of events, one that would satisfy official curiosity while revealing nothing of importance, his mind was already working through the next phase of a plan years in the making. The game had escalated sooner than he'd expected, but that simply meant adjusting the timeline, not abandoning the strategy. In the printing room below, the presses continued their relentless rhythm, a sound that had always reminded Chase of a heartbeat, but tonight it felt more like a drumbeat, calling soldiers to war. In Chicago's shadows, new players were taking the field, and the game was about to become far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The real question wasn't who would win, it was who would survive to write the final headline. Detective Morrison moved through the office with practiced efficiency, his keen eyes taking in details that others might miss. Interesting security setup you have here, he observed, noting the subtle cameras concealed in light fixtures. Pretty sophisticated for a newspaper office. Modern journalism requires modern precautions, Wallace replied smoothly, especially given recent events. At other publications, Morrison's attention shifted to Chase's desk, taking in its meticulous organization. "You're the crime beat reporter, right? Daniel Chase." His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. "Read your piece on the dock workers' strike last month. Remarkably detailed understanding of union politics for someone who usually covers petty theft." Chase maintained his carefully cultivated nervousness. "Just thorough research, detective. It's amazing what people will tell you when they think you're not important enough to be dangerous." Something flickered in Morrison's expression. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. "Funny thing about research," he said slowly. "I was looking into some old cases recently. Came across a series of articles from 5 years ago. Different papers, different reporters' names, but the writing style." He left the implication hanging. "Many reporters develop similar styles," Chase offered mildly. "It's the nature of newspaper work. We read each other's articles, absorb techniques." "True," Morrison agreed, "though not many develop such specific interests. Labor disputes, warehouse fires, shipping manifests, almost like someone's mapping connections that others might prefer stayed hidden." The tension in the room shifted subtly. Through the windows, they could see more police vehicles arriving, their lights painting the rain-slicked streets in alternating red and blue. But these weren't standard patrol cars. They bore the markings of federal agencies. Margaret, who had been quietly observing this exchange, stepped forward. "Detective, surely you're not suggesting that Daniel's routine crime reporting is part of some larger investigation? He can barely keep his desk organized." Morrison's laugh seemed genuine, but his eyes never left Chase. "No, of course not. Just professional curiosity. Though speaking of investigations," he produced a photograph from his coat pocket. "Know anything about this?" The image showed a man leaving a warehouse. Not the recently burned one, but another. Property across town. The figure was distant, partially obscured, but something about his bearing seemed familiar. "Should I?" Chase asked, adjusting his glasses as he studied the photo. "Taken 3 weeks ago, outside a building owned by White Star Exports. Same night, someone accessed their private records. Professional job, according to the security team. No traces left except this one photo." Morrison's voice remained casual. "Interesting thing is, our mystery man seems to be wearing glasses similar to yours, Mr. Chase. Wire-rimmed, if I'm not mistaken." "Wire-rimmed glasses are quite common, Detective," Chase replied with just the right note of confusion. "Though, I'm curious why you're sharing confidential case details with a newspaper reporter." Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe I'm hoping you'll notice something others missed. You have a reputation for seeing patterns, after all, even if most people don't notice you noticing." Before Chase could respond, commotion erupted from the street below. A sleek black car had arrived, its government plates catching the emergency. Lights. Men in dark suits emerged, their bearings suggesting federal authority. "Ah," Morrison sighed. "Looks like our conversation will have to wait. Seems the Treasury Department has taken an interest in your break-in." He moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing, Mr. Chase. That article you wrote about veterans finding unusual employment, you mentioned a particular unit, specialized in disguise and deception, called themselves the Ghost Brigade during the war." Chase's expression revealed nothing. "Historical research, Detective, nothing more." "Thing is," Morrison continued, "that unit's existence was classified. Most people who served never even knew it existed. Makes me wonder where a simple crime reporter would learn such specific details." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something passed between them. Recognition, challenge, or perhaps warning. Then Morrison was gone, leaving Chase to contemplate the new players entering the game. "Daniel," Margaret whispered urgently, Those federal agents, they're not Treasury. Look at how they're deploying, how they're covering sightlines. They're military intelligence." Chase was already moving, his actions precise and purposeful. From a hidden panel beneath his desk, he retrieved a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Time to accelerate the timeline. "Margaret, remember that story you were working on about corrupt customs officials? The one you said wasn't ready yet? Missing too many connections? The connections are in here." He handed her the package, along with evidence linking White Star exports to international arms shipments. "But it needs to come from you, not me. My byline is about to become complicated." Wallace watched this exchange with growing understanding. "All these years," he said quietly, "you've been building this, haven't you? Using the Herald as more than just cover, using it as a weapon against corruption." "A newspaper's greatest power isn't just in what it publishes," Chase replied, his voice carrying new authority. "It's in what it makes people think might be published. The stories they fear are coming, the truths they can't risk being exposed." Through the office windows, they could see the federal agents establishing a perimeter. Their movements suggested they weren't just securing the building, they were preparing for extraction. "Whatever happens next," Chase told his colleagues, "remember that the real story isn't always the one making headlines. Sometimes the most important truths are hidden in the small articles, the minor details that no one thinks to question." Margaret's expression shifted from concern to determination. "They're not just here for the documents, are they? They're here for you." Chase's smile carried years of careful planning finally coming to fruition. "Let's just say that certain people are about to discover that the most dangerous agent isn't the one carrying a badge or a gun. It's the one who spent years collecting their secrets, one unremarkable article at a time." The federal agents were in the building now, their footsteps echoing up the stairwell. But Chase seemed unconcerned, as if this too was part of some larger strategy. In the printing room below, the presses continued their relentless rhythm, but now they seemed to be counting down to something, not an ending, but a beginning. The game was changing, pieces moving into new positions, and Daniel Chase, master of disguise and deception, was about to reveal just how deep his investigation really went. The question wasn't whether he would survive the night. It was how many corrupt empires would fall before the final edition went to print. The game was changing, evolving into something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. And at its center stood Daniel Chase, a man who had spent years crafting the perfect disguise, waiting for exactly this moment to reveal that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun or a badge. It's the truth, carefully gathered and strategically deployed. Margaret moved closer to Chase, her voice barely a whisper. "The photographs I developed earlier, they weren't just of tonight's intruders, were they?" "Every image tells multiple stories," Chase replied softly. "If you know where to look, the angles, the lighting, the seemingly accidental details in the background. 5 years of documentation, building a web of evidence that no one can deny. Not Blackwood's." Radio crackled with urgent updates. More players were converging on the Herald building, representatives from every major power base in the city, all drawn by the growing realization that something momentous was unfolding. "Your Ghost Brigade training," Morrison observed, studying Chase with new understanding. "It wasn't just about disguise and infiltration, was it? It was about staging elaborate operations, creating scenarios that would force hidden players to reveal themselves." Chase's smile carried genuine appreciation. "The best operations are like well-written stories, Detective. You plant seeds early, develop themes gradually, build toward a revelation that seems inevitable in retrospect. Tonight's performance has been 5 years in the making." Through the windows, they could see the various factions taking positions. Callahan's men, federal agents, private security teams, all circling the building like wolves around prey. But something in their movements suggested uncertainty. a growing awareness that they might not be the hunters in this scenario. "Behind my desk," Chase told Margaret quietly, "there's a hidden panel. Inside, you'll find a series of photographs. Documentation of meetings that officially never happened, deals that were never recorded, connections that powerful people thought they'd buried." As Margaret retrieved the hidden cache, Not Blackwood's expression turned calculating. "You understand, we have protocols for situations like this, ways of ensuring certain information never reaches the public, like the protocols you used on Captain Edwards?" Chase's voice carried an edge of steel. "Or the ones you employed at the Hamburg operation. The Ghost Brigade's methods were effective, I'll grant you, but they left traces, patterns that someone with the right training could follow." Morrison had moved to cover the office door, his loyalties clearly shifting as he processed the implications. "The warehouse fire victims," he said slowly. "The bodies found in the rubble. They weren't random homeless people like the official report claimed, were they? Check their dental work," Chase suggested. "Particularly the gold fillings. They match rather specifically to certain European standards, the kind favored by arms dealers who operated behind the Iron Curtain." Not Blackwood's composure cracked further. "How long have you been watching us?" "Since Berlin," Chase replied simply. "Since I realized that the Ghost Brigade hadn't been disbanded, it had been repurposed. Turned from a military intelligence unit into something else, something that served private interests rather than national security." Margaret, examining the photographs she'd retrieved, drew in a sharp breath. "These men, they're supposed to be dead, killed in various accidents or crimes over the past 3 years. And yet there they are," Chase nodded, "very much alive, attending meetings with corporate executives, corrupt officials, and alleged crime bosses. Amazing how many dead men continue conducting business in this city." The tension in the room had shifted. Not Blackwood's team was no longer acting with their previous confidence. Outside, the various factions seemed to be realizing that surrounding the building might have been exactly what someone wanted them to do. "The Herald's archives," Chase continued, his voice carrying quiet authority, "contain 5 years of carefully crafted stories. Minor crime reports, business news, society columns, all seemingly unrelated, all building a comprehensive map of corruption. Every article is placed precisely, every detail serving multiple purposes." Morrison's expression showed growing respect. "You turned the entire newspaper into an intelligence operation." "What better cover?" Chase agreed. "Who suspects the reporter who never breaks a major story? Who questions the crime beat writer who seems barely competent enough to handle simple investigations? The Ghost Brigade taught us that the best disguise isn't just about changing your appearance. It's about creating a persona so consistent, so unremarkable, that no one thinks to look deeper." Through the office windows, more vehicles were arriving, but these were different. Unmarked vans that suggested the presence of legitimate federal agencies, cars bearing diplomatic plates, even a few vehicles whose occupants made Not Blackwood's. "Team shift uncomfortably. Your network," the silver-haired man said quietly, realization dawning. "It's not just reporters and photographers, is it? You've got people inside multiple agencies, different countries." "The Ghost Brigade's greatest weakness," Chase replied, "was always its isolation, its belief that it could operate without oversight, without accountability. But ghosts leave traces, Colonel. And some of us learned to follow those traces, to build connections, to create something stronger than any single organization." Margaret had begun organizing the photographs, her journalist's training allowing her to see patterns emerging. "These aren't just evidence of crimes," she breathed. "They're proof of an entire shadow government. Corporate executives working with crime bosses, military officers collaborating with arms dealers, politicians taking orders from foreign interests. All hidden in plain sight," Chase agreed, "protected by their belief that no one could see. The bigger picture, that no one would dare expose the truth." His smile carried no warmth. They forgot the first rule of deception. The best time to strike isn't when your target is vulnerable. It's when they think they're invincible. The printing presses below had begun running again, but this time they carried a different rhythm. This wasn't the normal evening edition being prepared. This was something else, something that made not Blackwood's expression turn grave. "What exactly is being printed right now, Mr. Chase?" "Insurance," Chase replied simply. "Every major newspaper in the country is receiving similar packages tonight. Evidence that can't be buried, connections that can't be denied, truth that won't stay hidden any longer." The distant wail of more sirens joined the symphony of tension surrounding the Herald building. But these weren't police vehicles. The pitch and pattern marked them as fire trucks, their urgent approach suggesting someone had escalated the night's stakes. "Fire alarms," Morrison noted grimly, checking his radio. "Multiple calls reporting. Smoke from the building's lower levels. All emergency responses are being redirected." Chase's expression showed no surprise, only grim confirmation. "Right on schedule. They're trying to create chaos, force an evacuation that will let them seize control of the situation." His eyes met, not Blackwood's. "Standard Ghost Brigade tactic, isn't it, Colonel? When direct action fails, change the battlefield." The silver-haired man's response was cut short by a new development. Through the office windows, they could see figures moving with military precision across neighboring rooftops. Snipers taking position, their equipment suggesting professional training beyond typical law enforcement. "Private security contractors," Chase observed. "Probably former special forces, hired through shell companies that trace back to White Star exports. The Ghost Brigade's favorite disposable assets." Margaret, still organizing the photographic evidence, looked up sharply. The fire department responded. "They're not just creating chaos. They're trying to destroy evidence, aren't they? Flood the building, damage the archives." "Among other things," Chase agreed. He moved to his desk with sudden purpose, retrieving what looked like an ordinary fountain pen. But his handling of it suggested something far more significant. "Fortunately, we planned for this contingency." Not Blackwood's team had begun shifting positions, responding to the changing tactical situation. Outside, the various factions surrounding the building were also moving, each group trying to maintain their advantage as the scenario evolved. "You're too late," the silver-haired man said, though something in his tone suggested uncertainty. "Even if your network manages to distribute some evidence, we have containment protocols. Ways of discrediting sources, manipulating narratives." Chase's laugh carried genuine amusement. "You still think this is about today's headlines? About one newspaper's exposé?" He held up the fountain pen, and now they could see it wasn't quite ordinary. Subtle modifications suggested specialized technology. "This isn't just about exposing past crimes. It's about revealing ongoing operations in real time." Morrison moved closer, professional curiosity overriding caution. "That's not just a pen, is it?" "Gift from a friend in British intelligence," Chase confirmed. "Fascinating device. Records conversations, transmits them directly to secure locations. Been capturing everything since our federal friends arrived, including some rather interesting admissions about containment protocols and shadow operations." The implications hit not Blackwood like a physical blow. His team's tactical positions suddenly seemed less advantageous, their careful planning transformed into vulnerability. "The Ghost Brigade taught us well," Chase continued, his mild manner completely gone, "especially about the importance of redundancy. Every conversation tonight has been recorded, every admission documented, every reaction photographed, all streaming to multiple secure locations. Through the windows they could see the first fire trucks arriving, their lights painting the gathering crowd in shifting patterns of red and white. But something was off about their deployment. subtle details that suggested this wasn't a standard emergency response. "Your people in the fire department," Chase noted with professional appreciation. "Very convincing. The trucks are authentic, the uniforms perfect. But real firefighters don't move like special operations teams, don't position themselves to cover. Tactical approaches." Margaret had moved to the window, her reporter's instincts catching details others might miss. "The crowd gathering below, they're not just spectators. Some of them are carrying press credentials, real ones, from major newspapers." "Of course they are," Chase smiled, "because legitimate journalists tend to notice when multiple newspapers receive the same anonymous tips about potential stories breaking at specific locations, especially when those tips come with enough preliminary evidence to justify sending senior reporters." Not Blackwood's composure cracked further. "You didn't just plan for tonight. You orchestrated it, created a situation that would draw attention, force us to act publicly, while ensuring that legitimate witnesses would be present to document everything," Chase finished. "The Ghost Brigade's methods were effective, but they relied too heavily on operating in shadows, on controlling narratives through intimidation and manipulation." Morrison's radio crackled with urgent updates. More police units were responding, but these weren't local. Federal agencies were taking notice, drawn by the growing situation and reports of armed men surrounding a newspaper office. "Your network," Not Blackwood said slowly, realization dawning. "It's not just about gathering evidence. You've been laying groundwork, positioning pieces, creating a situation where we'd have no choice but to reveal ourselves." 5 years of careful preparation, Chase agreed. Building connections, establishing credibility, waiting for the right moment. The Ghost Brigade taught us the importance of patience, of strategic timing, though I doubt they expected those lessons to be used against them. The tension in the room shifted as a new sound cut through the night. Helicopters approaching, their distinctive engine noise suggesting military rather than civilian craft. "National Guard," Morrison identified, checking his radio. "Responding to reports of potential domestic terrorism. Someone higher up is taking this situation very seriously." Chase's smile carried satisfaction rather than triumph. Amazing how quickly things escalate when multiple agencies start receiving evidence of organized crime connecting to military contractors. When international arms deals trace back to supposedly legitimate businesses. When corruption leads straight to the highest levels of government. Not Blackwood's hand had returned to his weapon, but his tactical position was deteriorating. His team was now effectively trapped between multiple converging forces, none of which they could control or manipulate. "The warehouse fire," he said, quietly, understanding finally dawning. "The documents weren't what mattered. You wanted us to think they were important enough to risk exposing ourselves." "The best bait," Chase agreed, "is something the target already believes is valuable. You thought you were protecting operational security, preventing the exposure of your shadow network. Instead, you walked right into a trap 5 years in the making." Through the office windows, they could see the situation outside growing more complex. Legitimate federal agents were establishing perimeters, separating various factions that had surrounded the building. The fake firefighters found themselves caught between actual emergency responders and increasingly suspicious law enforcement. "Your Ghost Brigade training," Morrison observed, studying Chase with new respect. "It wasn't just about disguise and infiltration. You learned their methods, their protocols, their ways of thinking, and used that knowledge to create a scenario they couldn't ignore," Chase confirmed. "One that would force them to deploy assets, reveal connections, demonstrate the very corruption we've spent years documenting." Margaret had finished organizing the photographic evidence, laying out a damning timeline of conspiracy and corruption. These aren't just random criminal enterprises, she breathed. This is systematic, international arms deals disguised as legitimate business, political influence bought and sold, military assets used for private operations. All hidden in plain sight, Chase agreed, protected by people who thought their power made them untouchable, who never imagined that someone could spend years mapping their connections, documenting their operations, preparing to expose everything at precisely the right moment. The printing presses below had taken on a new rhythm, their thunder carrying through the building's foundations. This wasn't just the evening edition being prepared, this was something else, something that made not Blackwood's expression turn grave. What exactly is being printed right now, Mr. Chase? The truth, he replied simply. Not just about tonight's events, but about everything we've uncovered, every connection, every operation, every piece of corruption we've documented, being printed simultaneously in newspapers across the country, distributed through channels you can't control or stop. The night was far from over, but something fundamental had shifted. The carefully constructed facades of power were crumbling, replaced by a new kind of tension, the kind that comes when truth finally emerges from shadow, when corruption loses its shield of deniability, and at the center of it all stood Daniel Chase, master of disguise and deception, who had spent 5 years crafting the perfect trap, not just for criminals or corrupt officials, but for an entire system that had thought itself beyond the reach of justice. The game wasn't just changing. It was transforming into something its players had never imagined. And the next moves would determine not just who survived, but what kind of truth would emerge from this night of revelation and reckoning. A new sound cut through the tension. Rapid footsteps approaching from the stairwell. The door burst open, admitting Sarah Chen, the Herald's chief photographer. Her camera hung ready, but her expression carried urgent warning. "We've got movement in the basement," she reported, nodding to Chase with familiar respect. "Teams accessing the old tunnel system, professional equipment, military-grade thermal imaging." Chase's response was immediate but measured. "How many access points?" "3 that I've spotted. They're using the old Prohibition-era routes, the ones that aren't on any official building plans." Sarah's eyes met his. "Just like you said they would." Not Blackwood's expression tightened. "You have a plant in our surveillance team. Better," Chase smiled. "I have people who've spent years mapping every entrance, every escape route, every tactical advantage this building offers. The Ghost Brigade isn't the only organization that knows how to plan for contingencies." Morrison's radio crackled with new updates. The National Guard units were establishing a wider perimeter, pushing back the gathering crowd of journalists and spectators, but among those being displaced were faces that caught Chase's professional attention. "Interesting," he murmured. "Your Baltic operation is well represented tonight, Colonel. Latvian intelligence, Estonian counter-surveillance, even that gentleman from the Polish embassy who's supposedly a cultural attaché." The silver-haired man's composure cracked further. "How could you possibly know their actual identities?" Chase finished. "The same way I know about the Ghost Brigade's involvement in certain Eastern European arms deals. The same way I know about White Star Export's real shipping manifests. Information is a currency all its own, Colonel, and some of us have spent years building our accounts." Sarah had moved to a particular filing cabinet, her movement suggesting familiarity with its hidden modifications. "The secondary archives are secured. Everything's been transferred to the backup locations, just like we planned." "Excellent," Chase nodded. "And the special equipment?" "In position. Though I still don't understand why you wanted those particular angles covered." "Because our friends below aren't just looking for documents," Chase explained. "They're searching for something specific, something that went missing during the Hamburg operation, something that could unravel everything they've built. Not Blackwood's. Reaction was subtle but telling. His team's tactical positions shifted slightly, responding to unspoken commands. The Hamburg files were destroyed, the silver-haired man said carefully. The facility was completely demolished. Was it? Chase's mild manner had an edge now. Or did someone ensure that certain evidence survived? The kind that proves the Ghost Brigade wasn't just following orders, they were facilitating private arms deals, using military resources for personal profit. Through the windows, they could see new players emerging. Dark sedans with diplomatic plates, unmarked vans suggesting the presence of intelligence agencies, even some faces that made not Blackwood's team visibly tense. Your network, the colonel said slowly. It's not just domestic, is it? You've got connections to foreign intelligence services. The Ghost Brigade's operations left traces across multiple countries, Chase confirmed. Created enemies they never expected would find common cause. Amazing how many people are willing to cooperate when they discover they're all hunting the same corruption. Sarah had begun positioning herself strategically, her camera ready, but her attention focused on specific angles. She moved like someone with tactical training, though her cover as a photographer remained perfect. The warehouse fire, Morrison mused, pieces clicking together. The documents everyone's been chasing, they're not actually about local corruption at all, are they? They're proof, Chase explained, that certain American military contractors have been selling weapons to both sides in various European conflicts, using legitimate businesses as cover, using criminal enterprises for distribution, using political influence to protect their operations. Margaret studied the photographic evidence with new understanding. That's why the Ghost Brigade got involved. They're not just trying to protect their own operations, they're defending an entire network of corruption. A network, Chase agreed, that spans continents, connects governments, links criminal enterprises to legitimate businesses, all hidden behind layers of deniability and misdirection. His smile carried no warmth. Until someone spends years gathering evidence, building cases, preparing to expose everything simultaneously, the tension in the room shifted as new sounds emerged from below. Not just footsteps now, but the subtle vibrations of heavy equipment being moved through the tunnel system. They're not just searching, Sarah observed, her photographer's eye, catching details others might miss. They're setting up for something bigger, multiple teams, coordinated movements. Of course they are, Chase nodded. Because they've finally realized what tonight really represents. This isn't just about exposing past crimes or current operations. It's about revealing the entire system they've built. The connections between military contractors and arms dealers, between corrupt officials and criminal enterprises, between legitimate businesses and shadow operations. Not Blackwood's expression turned calculating. You understand what you're risking, the kind of forces you're challenging? Better than most, Chase replied, and for a moment his voice carried echoes of old pain. I was there in Hamburg, Colonel. Saw how deep the corruption went. Watched good people die because they discovered the truth about who was really profiting from chaos and conflict. The silver-haired man's hand tightened on his weapon. Hamburg was a necessary operation. The kind of hard decision that lets people profit from suffering? Chase's mild manner vanished completely. That turns military assets into private enforcers, that transforms intelligence operations into protection for arms dealers. Through the office windows, they could see the situation outside growing more complex. The National Guard's presence had forced various factions to reveal their true allegiances. Legitimate federal agents were separating from private security teams. Criminal enterprises were discovering their carefully maintained deniability crumbling. Your Ghost Brigade training, Morrison observed, studying Chase with new respect. You didn't just learn their methods, you learned their weaknesses, their blind spots, their assumptions about what makes an operation successful. The brigade's greatest flaw, Chase agreed, was believing that power comes from operating in shadows, from controlling information, manipulating narratives, enforcing silence. His smile carried years of patient planning, finally bearing fruit. They never understood that the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun or a badge or even a secret. It's the truth, properly documented and strategically revealed. The printing presses below had taken on an almost triumphant rhythm now, their thunder, carrying through the building's foundations, not just printing newspapers anymore, but recording history, documenting the moment when shadows finally gave way to light, when corruption lost its shield of deniability. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Chase, master of disguise and deception, who had spent 5 years crafting the perfect moment. Not just to expose crimes or reveal corruption, but to transform the very nature of power itself. To prove that sometimes the most effective revolution isn't fought with weapons or violence. It's accomplished with evidence and truth, carefully gathered and precisely deployed. The game wasn't just changing. It was becoming something entirely new. A battle not just for survival or power, but for the very nature of truth itself. And the next moves would determine not just who emerged victorious, but what kind of world would rise from this night of revelation and reckoning. The building's ancient radiators hissed, a sound that made Sarah's head snap up. "That's not steam," she said sharply. "They're introducing something into the ventilation system." Chase was already moving, retrieving what looked like ordinary gas masks from a hidden compartment. "Standard Ghost Brigade tactic," he explained, distributing the equipment. "When direct confrontation fails, change the environmental conditions. CS gas." Not Blackwood identified, his professional mask cracking further. "But how did you know?" "Because I helped design these protocols," Chase replied, his voice muffled by his mask. "Hamburg wasn't just an operation gone wrong. It was a testing ground. New methods of crowd control, population management, civilization suppression, all developed by military contractors, all sold to the highest bidders." Morrison's radio crackled with urgent updates. The National Guard units had detected the gas deployment, their response suggesting this wasn't the first time they'd encountered such tactics. "Your people are well trained," Chase observed, noting the precision of their movements, "but they're still thinking like military operators, still following protocols designed for battlefield conditions." His smile, though hidden by the mask, carried in his voice. "They haven't realized they're not fighting soldiers anymore. They're facing journalists." Through the windows they could see the gas beginning to affect the crowds below. But something unexpected was happening. Instead of panicking or dispersing, many of the journalists were donning their own protective gear, their cameras continuing to record everything. "Fascinating," Not Blackwood breathed. "You didn't just prepare your own people. You warned the press, made sure they'd be ready to document everything." "Truth is like water," Chase replied, retrieving more equipment from his hidden caches. "It finds ways through every barrier, especially when people are prepared to help it flow." He handed Sarah what looked like specialized camera filters. "Speaking of which," the photographer nodded, understanding immediately. She began adjusting her equipment, preparing to document whatever came next. "The infrared settings you insisted on, this is why, isn't it? You knew they'd try to use gas or smoke for cover." "The Ghost Brigade's tactics are effective," Chase agreed, "but predictable if you understand their methodology. They rely too heavily on controlling what people can see, what they can prove." Margaret had moved to the windows, her reporters, instincts catching details others might miss. "The crowd's changing," she observed. "Those spectators being pushed back by the National Guard, some of them are carrying professional recording equipment. Multiple angles, redundant coverage. Because the best defense against corruption isn't just gathering evidence, Chase explained. It's ensuring that evidence is witnessed, documented, and distributed beyond any single point of control. Not Blackwood's team had taken up new positions, adapting to the changing situation, but their tactical advantage was eroding with each passing moment. Through the gas-filled air, they could see more vehicles arriving, but these weren't military or law enforcement, news vans, Morrison identified. Not just local stations, national networks, even some international press logos. Amazing how quickly media organizations respond when they receive credible evidence of international corruption, Chase noted. Especially when that evidence connects American military contractors to foreign arms deals, links criminal enterprises to government operations, exposes the kind of story that defines careers. The silver-haired man's composure cracked further. You're not just exposing operations, you're destroying entire systems of influence, power structures that took decades to build. Power built on corruption isn't power at all, Chase countered. It's just a delayed collapse. And tonight, everything collapses simultaneously. Not just in Chicago, not just in America, but everywhere your shadow network extends. Sarah's camera clicked steadily, documenting each reaction, each revelation. But her movements suggested more than just photographic training. She positioned herself with tactical awareness, covering angles that spoke of military experience. Hamburg, not Blackwood said slowly, recognition dawning. You weren't just there as an observer, you were part of the resistance cell, the one that discovered our real operations. Smart man, Chase nodded, though you missed the more important detail. Who do you think helped that resistance cell understand what they were really fighting? Who taught them to gather evidence instead of just attacking blindly? The implications hit the room like a physical force. Through the gas-filled air, they could see the various factions outside beginning to turn on each other. Criminal enterprises realizing they'd been manipulated, legitimate authorities discovering their orders came from compromised sources, private security teams recognizing their positions had become untenable. Your network, Morrison breathed, understanding finally dawning. It's not just about exposing current corruption. You've been building something to replace the symptoms you're destroying, a new way of fighting corruption based on evidence and transparency instead of violence and control. Chase's response was interrupted by new sounds from below, not just movement in the tunnels now, but the distinctive reports of gunfire. The various teams searching the basement had encountered something unexpected. "Ah," he said mildly. "Right, on schedule. It seems your people have found the special storage room, the one containing evidence about certain military contracts. Amazing how quickly professional soldiers lose discipline when they discover proof they've been working for arms dealers instead of legitimate authorities." Not Blackwood's radio crackled with urgent reports. His basement teams were in chaos, turning on each other as they discovered documents that revealed their true employers, their real missions, the actual nature of their operations. "You didn't just gather evidence," the silver-haired man said, quietly. "You weaponized it, turned truth itself into a tool for destroying the very organizations you infiltrated." "The Ghost Brigade taught us well," Chase agreed, "especially about how to turn an enemy's strength into weakness. You relied on secrecy, on compartmentalization, on keeping each part of your operation ignorant of the larger picture." His smile carried no warmth. "But secrets are like seeds. Plant them carefully, water them with evidence, and watch what grows when light finally reaches them." Through the windows, they could see the gas beginning to dissipate. But something had fundamentally changed in the scene below. The careful alliances between criminal enterprises and legitimate authorities had shattered. The private security teams were discovering their orders came from compromised sources. The entire careful balance of power was dissolving, replaced by something new and unpredictable. "You've started a war," Not Blackwood observed grimly. "No," Chase corrected. "I've ended one. The war you've been waging against truth itself, against the very idea that power should be accountable, that corruption should have consequences." He gestured to the chaos unfolding below. "Tonight isn't about violence or control. It's about revelation, about showing everyone exactly what they've been fighting for, what they've been protecting, what they've been serving." The printing presses thundered below, their rhythm now matching the pulse of history being made. Not just printing newspapers anymore, but recording the moment when shadows finally gave way to light, when corruption lost its shield of deniability, when truth became more powerful than any weapon. The game wasn't just changing, it was becoming something entirely new, a battle not just for survival or power, but for the very nature of reality itself. And as the gas cleared and the truth emerged, everyone involved was beginning to realize that tonight would determine not just who survived, but what kind of world would emerge from this crucible of revelation and reckoning. The chaos in the basement had reached a critical point. Through the building's ancient pipes, they could hear the sounds of confrontation, not just gunfire now, but the distinctive chaos of professional soldiers discovering they'd been fighting for the wrong side. "Interesting thing about mercenaries," Chase observed, checking one of several hidden monitors he'd revealed. "Their loyalty extends exactly as far as their confidence in their employers. Show them proof they've been manipulated, that their mission served arms dealers instead of national security." A particularly loud burst of gunfire punctuated his words. On the monitors, they could see teams of professional soldiers turning. On their commanders, their disciplined formations dissolving as reality shattered their carefully maintained illusions. "Your basement teams are very well trained," Sarah noted, studying the footage with professional appreciation. "Ex-military, probably special forces, the kind of men who take pride in serving legitimate authority." Her smile carried dark satisfaction. "Imagine how they feel, discovering they've been working for international arms dealers, helping suppress evidence of war crimes." Not Blackwood's composure cracked further as he watched his carefully orchestrated operation implode. Those documents, it was supposed to be destroyed. The Hamburg facility was completely demolished. Was it? Chase's mild manner had an edge now. Or did someone ensure certain evidence survived, the kind that proves military contractors were selling weapons to both sides in various conflicts, using legitimate operations as cover for private arms deals, trading in death while pretending to serve national security? Through the windows, they could see the situation outside evolving rapidly. The gas attack had backfired spectacularly, forcing various factions to reveal their true capabilities. Criminal enterprises discovering their tactical advantage evaporate. Private security teams realized their positions had become compromised. "Your people are well equipped," Morrison observed, noting the professional gear carried by supposedly simple journalists, almost like they were expecting this kind of response. "The Ghost Brigade's tactics are effective but predictable," Chase replied. "They rely too heavily on controlling the environment, on using chaos to hide their true operations." His smile carried professional appreciation. "But chaos works both ways. Sometimes it reveals more than it conceals." Margaret had been monitoring various news feeds on her phone, her expression growing increasingly animated. "It's not just happening here," she reported. "Similar situations are unfolding across the country. Newspaper offices receiving mysterious packages, evidence of corruption emerging simultaneously in multiple cities." "Because the best way to fight a networked conspiracy," Chase explained, "is with a network of truth. Hundreds of journalists, photographers, and investigators, all coordinated to expose everything simultaneously. No single point of failure, no way to contain the revelations." Not Blackwood's radio crackled with increasingly urgent reports. His remaining teams were discovering their tactical advantage dissolving, their carefully planned operation transforming into something they couldn't control. "You don't understand what you're destroying," the silver-haired man warned. "The systems we built, the stability we maintain." "Stability built on corruption isn't stability at all," Sarah countered, her camera continuing to document everything. "It's just a delayed collapse. And tonight, everything collapses at once." New sounds emerged from the stairwell, heavy footsteps approaching with military precision. But these weren't Ghost Brigade operators or private security. The distinctive rhythm spoke of legitimate military training. National Guard Tactical Team, Morrison identified, checking his radio, responding to reports of armed confrontation in a civilian structure. "Their commander is—" He paused, something like respect crossing his features. "Captain Catherine Edwards." The name landed like a thunderbolt. Not Blackwood's team visibly tensed, while Chase's smile carried grim satisfaction. "James Edwards. Sister," he confirmed. "The one who spent 5 years investigating her brother's disappearance. Amazing how many doors open for a determined woman with military credentials and a personal stake in exposing corruption." The office door opened with controlled precision, admitting a tall woman whose National Guard uniform couldn't quite hide her combat veteran's bearing. Captain Edwards surveyed the scene with professional detachment. Through her eyes lingered on not Blackwood with dangerous recognition. "Colonel," she acknowledged coldly. "Or should I say Mr. Stevens, since you're apparently working for private interests these days." The silver-haired man's mask of federal authority cracked completely. "Catherine, your brother understood the necessity of our work, the importance of maintaining certain arrangements. My brother," she cut him off, "discovered you were selling weapons to terrorist organizations, using military resources for private profit, trading in death while pretending to serve national security." Her smile carried years of patient vengeance. "He died trying to expose you, or at least that's what you wanted everyone to believe." Chase moved with subtle precision, positioning himself to cover specific angles. "Should we tell him the truth, Captain? About how James survived Hamburg? How he spent the last 5 years gathering evidence from inside White Star exports?" Not Blackwood's expression shifted from shock to calculation to dawning horror. "The cleaning staff, the supposedly invisible workers who maintained our secure facilities, are often the best place to gather intelligence," Catherine finished. "Especially when they're highly trained military operatives who understand exactly what to look for, what documents to copy, what conversations to record, what connections to map." Through the windows, they could see more National Guard units deploying, their movements suggesting this was more than a standard tactical response. These were counter-terrorism specialists, experts in dealing with rogue military operators. "Your brother's alive," Not Blackwood breathed, pieces finally clicking together. "He's been working with Chase this whole time, building evidence, preparing for this moment." "James always was the patient one," Catherine agreed. "Understood that sometimes the best revenge isn't quick violence, it's careful documentation. Building cases that can't be denied, evidence that can't be buried." Sarah's camera continued recording, capturing every reaction, every revelation, but her movements suggested more than just photographic interest. She was documenting specific details, creating evidence that would stand up in military tribunals and international courts. "The Hamburg operation," Not Blackwood said slowly, understanding finally dawning. "It wasn't just about arms deals or military contracts. You were building something larger, creating a network of investigators, journalists, and military personnel, all focused on exposing systemic corruption." "Smart man," Chase nodded, "though you missed the most important detail. Why do you think Catherine's team was chosen to respond tonight? Why these specific National Guard units?" The implications hit like physical force. Through the office windows, they could see more military vehicles arriving. But these weren't just tactical response teams. These were specialized units dedicated to investigating corruption within the armed forces. Your network, the silver-haired man whispered. It's not just civilians. You've got people inside military intelligence, counter-terrorism units. People who understand that real national security, Catherine finished, comes from exposing corruption, not protecting it. From serving truth rather than power. The printing presses below had taken on a different rhythm now, their thunder carrying notes of triumph. This wasn't just about printing newspapers anymore. This was about recording history, about documenting. The moment when shadow operations finally faced the light of truth, Morrison's radio crackled with new updates. Similar situations were unfolding across the city. Private security teams discovering their orders came from compromised sources. Criminal enterprises realizing their protective networks had evaporated. An entire system of corruption and control, dissolving under the weight of exposed truth. You haven't just exposed operations, Not Blackwood said quietly. You've created something entirely new. A way of fighting corruption that doesn't rely on violence or force. Because the most effective weapon against corruption, Chase replied, isn't a gun or a badge or even military power. It's the truth, properly documented and strategically deployed, something the Ghost Brigade never understood. Catherine's team had begun securing the office, their movements suggesting this was more than just a tactical operation. They were gathering evidence, documenting connections, building cases that would stand up in military courts and international tribunals. The game wasn't just changing. It was being transformed at its fundamental level. Power structures that had operated in shadows for decades were being dragged into light. Systems of corruption that thought themselves untouchable were discovering that no amount of force can withstand the impact of revealed truth. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Chase, master of disguise and deception, who had spent 5 years crafting this moment, not just to expose corruption or reveal crimes, but to demonstrate that sometimes the most effective revolution isn't fought with weapons or violence. It's accomplished with evidence and truth, carefully gathered and precisely deployed. The night was far from over, but something fundamental had shifted. The careful balance of power that had protected corruption was crumbling, replaced by something new and unprecedented. A system where truth became more powerful than any weapon, where evidence could shatter entire empires of corruption. The real question wasn't who would survive. It was what kind of world would emerge from this crucible of revelation and justice. And as the printing presses thundered below, recording history in real time, everyone involved began to realize that tonight would determine not just the fate of individuals or organizations, but the very nature of power itself. "There's something else," Catherine said, checking one of several specialized devices she'd brought. The basement teams weren't just searching for documents. Their equipment suggests they're looking for something specific, something electronic. Chase's expression shifted subtly. The Hamburg device, they think it's here. Not Blackwood's reaction was immediate and visceral. "That's impossible. The device was destroyed in the facility explosion. We confirmed." "You confirmed what your teams reported," Chase corrected. "Teams that had already been compromised, already working with our network. Amazing how easy it is to falsify destruction reports when you understand military protocols." Sarah moved to a particular filing cabinet, her movements suggesting familiarity with its hidden mechanisms. "That's why you insisted on those specific modifications, not just for storing documents, but for housing sensitive electronic equipment," Chase finished. "The kind that can record encrypted military communications, document arms deals being conducted through official channels, prove that legitimate military operations were being used as cover for private weapons sales." Through the office windows, they could see more specialized units arriving. These weren't just National Guard teams. These were military intelligence specialists, experts in dealing with compromised command structures. The device doesn't just contain evidence of past operations, Catherine explained, her voice carrying professional satisfaction. It's still active, still gathering data. Every secure communication, every coded transmission, every attempt to coordinate their response tonight is being recorded and analyzed. Chase nodded, proving that they're not just trying to protect old secrets. They're actively using military resources for private operations. Right now, in real time, Morrison studied the growing military presence outside with new understanding. That's why you needed legitimate military units involved, not just for tactical support, but for legal authority, Catherine confirmed. Active evidence of military resources being misused triggers specific protocols, puts certain units under direct federal control, bypassing potentially compromised command structures. Not Blackwood's composure cracked further as implications hit home. The device wasn't just recording operations, it was mapping command structures, identifying which officers were compromised, which units were being used for private missions, creating a comprehensive map of corruption within military contractors. Chase agreed, showing how legitimate operations were being subverted, how official resources were being redirected to serve private interests. Sarah's camera continued documenting everything, but her attention had shifted to specific monitors showing the basement confrontation. They're starting to realize, she observed. The professional teams down there, they're beginning to understand what they're really part of. Through the building's security systems, they could see the chaos unfolding below. Elite military, operators discovering their missions, served arms dealers rather than national security. Professional soldiers realized they'd been used to protect private criminal enterprises. Fascinating thing about professional military personnel, Chase noted, mildly. They tend to react poorly to discovering they've been manipulated, that their skills, their loyalty, their dedication to duty has been exploited for private profit. Catherine's radio crackled with urgent updates. Similar situations were unfolding at military installations across the country, units discovering their orders came from compromised sources, officers realizing their commands had been subverted to serve private interests. It's not just about exposing past crimes, she said quietly. We're dismantling entire command structures, revealing how deeply the corruption has penetrated military operations. Which is why certain people are becoming desperate, Chase agreed. His attention shifted to specific monitors showing movement in the building's old tunnel system. They're making their final play, bringing in their most reliable teams, the ones they think can't be turned, because those teams are already compromised. Not Blackwood finished, understanding dawning. They're not just mercenaries or private security. They're foreign military personnel operating under deep cover, provided by White Star Exports, Chase confirmed, using legitimate military contracts as cover for inserting foreign operators into American territory. Another piece of evidence the Hamburg device has been collecting. The tension in the room shifted as new sounds emerged from below, not just gunfire now, but the distinctive chaos of professional military units engaging foreign operators. The carefully maintained fiction of legitimate security operations was dissolving, replaced by the raw reality of international infiltration. Your network, Not Blackwood said slowly. It's not just about exposing corruption. You're forcing every compromised organization to reveal itself, to demonstrate exactly how deep the infiltration goes. Because sometimes the best way to fight corruption, Chase replied, is to let it expose itself, to create situations where compromised systems have no choice but to demonstrate exactly how they've been subverted. Through the office windows, they could see military intelligence units deploying specialized equipment, not just tactical gear, but the kind of technology used to detect and track foreign communications. The device isn't just gathering evidence, Catherine explained, professional satisfaction evident in her voice. It's creating a real-time map of every compromised system, every subverted command structure, every foreign operation hiding behind legitimate military authority. Sarah's camera continued recording, but her movements had become more focused. She was documenting specific details, unit patches, equipment configurations, tactical formations, creating evidence that would prove foreign military units had been operating on American soil under the cover of private security contracts. "This isn't just about tonight," Morrison observed, understanding finally dawning. "You're not just exposing current operations, you're creating a template for fighting this kind of corruption, showing how to identify it, document it, dismantle it. Because the best weapon against systemic corruption," Chase agreed, "isn't just exposing individual crimes. It's revealing the entire system, showing how it operates, demonstrating how deeply it's penetrated legitimate institutions." The printing presses below had taken on an almost triumphant rhythm now, their thunder carrying through the building's foundations. But they weren't just printing newspapers anymore. They were recording a fundamental shift in how power itself operated, how corruption could be fought, and how truth could become more powerful than any weapon. The game wasn't just changing, it was being transformed at its most fundamental level. And as military units engaged foreign operators in the basement, as compromised command structures revealed themselves, as evidence continued accumulating, everyone involved began to realize that tonight would determine not just who survived, but what kind of world would emerge from this crucible of revelation and justice. A new sound cut through the chaos, distinctive clicks from Catherine's specialized equipment. "We've got encrypted transmissions," she reported, studying the data. "Multiple sources using diplomatic frequencies. Someone's calling in reinforcements." Chase moved to check specific monitors, his movements suggesting he'd anticipated this development. They're finally understanding the real scope of what's happening, that this isn't just about exposing past operations or current crimes. It's about revealing their entire global network. Sarah finished, her camera documenting specific equipment configurations, proving how deep the infiltration goes, how many different agencies and organizations have been compromised. Through the office windows, they could see new vehicles arriving, not military or law enforcement this time, but diplomatic corps. Cars bearing official markings from multiple embassies, their occupants moving with the kind of precision that suggested more than diplomatic training. "Interesting choice of response units," Chase observed mildly. "I count representatives from at least 5 different nations, all supposedly here to protect their diplomatic interests. All connected to White Star exports," Catherine added, checking data on her specialized equipment. "All involved in arms deals disguised as legitimate military contracts, all about to discover their secure communications have been compromised." Not Blackwood's expression shifted from professional control to growing alarm. The Hamburg device, it's not just recording current transmissions. It's been gathering everything, hasn't it? Building a comprehensive map of international operations. "Amazing how much evidence you can collect," Chase agreed, "when people think their communications are secure, when they use diplomatic channels to coordinate arms deals, when they transmit operational orders through supposedly unbreakable encryption." Morrison's radio crackled with urgent updates. The situation was escalating beyond local control. Federal agencies were responding to reports of foreign military units operating on American soil. International intelligence services were detecting unauthorized operations within their territories. "Your network," Not Blackwood said slowly, realization dawning. "It's not just domestic investigators and military personnel. You've got people inside foreign intelligence services, international law enforcement." "Because corruption doesn't stop at national borders," Chase replied. It forms networks, builds connections, creates systems that span continents. The only way to fight it effectively is to build something larger, something that transcends individual agencies or jurisdictions. Sarah had moved to a particular window, her photographer's eye catching crucial details. The diplomatic teams, they're not just here to gather intelligence. Look at how they're deploying, how they're coordinating movements. They're preparing for extraction, Catherine confirmed, monitoring encrypted transmissions. Not just of personnel, but of evidence. They think they can still contain this, still protect their operations. Chase's smile carried professional appreciation. They haven't realized that everything they're doing, every attempt to coordinate response or protect assets, is just creating more evidence, more proof of how deeply foreign military units have penetrated legitimate operations. Through the building's security systems, they could see the basement confrontation evolving. The professional teams weren't just fighting anymore. They were actively choosing sides. Some maintained loyalty to their handlers, others turning against commanders who had betrayed their trust. Fascinating thing about professional soldiers, Chase observed. Their loyalty isn't just to orders or authority, it's to principles. Show them proof they've been manipulated, that their skills have been used to protect arms dealers and war criminals. And suddenly they start questioning everything. Catherine finished. Every mission, every operation, every order they've followed. Start wondering how many times they've been used to protect private interests rather than national security. Not Blackwood's radio crackled with increasingly desperate transmissions. His remaining loyal units were discovering their tactical advantage was evaporating. Their carefully planned operations transformed into something they couldn't control or contain. You don't understand what you're unleashing, the silver-haired man warned. The systems we built, the networks we created, they maintain stability, keep certain forces in check. Keep arms dealers protected, Sarah countered, her camera continuing to document everything. Keep war criminals safe. Keep corrupt officials in power. Some systems deserve to collapse. Through the office windows, they could see military intelligence. Units deploying specialized equipment, technology designed to track foreign communications, identify unauthorized operations, map networks of infiltration and compromise. The Hamburg device isn't just gathering evidence, Catherine explained, professional satisfaction evident in her voice. It's creating a real-time map of corruption, showing how private military contractors connect to arms dealers, how criminal enterprises link to government agencies, how supposedly legitimate operations serve as cover for international crimes. Morrison studied the growing chaos with new understanding. This isn't just about exposing current operations. You're creating a template for identifying and fighting systemic corruption, showing how deep it goes, how it operates, how it can be dismantled. Because the best weapon against corruption, Chase agreed, isn't just exposing individual crimes, it's revealing entire systems, showing how they penetrate legitimate institutions, how they subvert official authority, how they turn military and law enforcement assets into private enforcement tools. The printing presses below had taken on an almost triumphant rhythm now, their thunder carrying through the building's foundations. But they weren't just printing newspapers anymore. They were recording a fundamental shift in how power itself operated, how corruption could be fought, and how truth could become more powerful than any weapon. Catherine's equipment detected new transmissions, urgent communications between compromised units, desperate attempts to coordinate response and protect assets. But each transmission just added to the evidence, just demonstrated more clearly how deeply foreign operators had infiltrated legitimate operations. They still think they can contain this, she observed, monitoring the data. Still believe they can protect their networks, maintain their systems of control. Because they don't understand what's really happening, Chase replied. This isn't just about exposing crimes or revealing corruption. It's about transforming how power itself operates, creating something new, a system where truth becomes more powerful than any weapon, where evidence can shatter entire empires of corruption. The game wasn't just changing, it was becoming something entirely new. And as military units engaged foreign operators, as compromised command structures revealed themselves, as evidence continued accumulating, everyone involved began to realize that tonight would determine not just who survived, but what kind of world would emerge from this crucible of revelation and justice. A world where the most dangerous weapon wasn't a gun or a badge or even military power. It was the truth, properly documented and strategically deployed. The rhythm of the city had changed. Through the herald's windows, they could see Chicago's nightlife grinding to a halt as news spread of the unfolding situation. But something else was moving through the streets. Figures that didn't quite fit the usual patterns of urban life. "Your network's responding," Sarah observed, her camera catching glimpses of people moving with purpose through the gathering crowds. Not just journalists and investigators, but everyone who's been waiting for this moment, Chase confirmed. Every person who's gathered evidence, documented corruption, prepared to stand when the signal came. Catherine's specialized equipment continued monitoring encrypted communications, but her attention had shifted to specific frequencies. "We're getting confirmation from other cities. Similar situations are unfolding at newspapers across the country. Evidence emerging simultaneously, because the best way to fight a networked conspiracy," Chase explained, "is with a network of truth. Hundreds of investigators, journalists, and whistleblowers, all coordinated to expose everything at once." Through the office windows, they could see new players emerging from the urban landscape. Not military or law enforcement, but people who moved with the kind of awareness that suggested specialized training. Former intelligence operatives, retired investigators, people who had walked away from corrupt systems but maintained their skills. "Fascinating demographic," Not Blackwood observed, professional appreciation mixing with growing concern. How many others walked away from the Ghost Brigade? How many kept watching, gathering evidence, waiting for a chance to expose what they'd discovered? "More than you imagined," Chase replied. People who understood that sometimes the best way to fight corruption isn't from within official channels. It's from positions no one thinks to watch. Morrison's radio crackled with new updates. The situation was spreading beyond the Herald. Building. Other locations across Chicago were reporting similar gatherings, people emerging from seemingly ordinary lives to reveal years of careful documentation and investigation. The bookstore owner on 5th, Sarah identified, recognizing faces in the crowd. The bartender at O'Malley's, the janitor at City Hall, they're all part of your network, aren't they? People in positions to observe without being noticed, Chase confirmed. Who understands that sometimes the most effective investigators are the ones no one thinks to guard against? Catherine's equipment detected new patterns of movement. Through the basement's chaos, professional teams were discovering they weren't just fighting other military units, they were encountering civilians with surprising levels of tactical knowledge. Your people have military training, not Blackwood, noted, studying security footage. Not just basic skills, but specialized operations experience, the kind that suggests... How many of them served alongside you? Chase finished. Worked on the same classified operations, saw the same evidence of corruption, and chose to do something about it? A new sound cut through the night. Helicopters approaching, but not military or law enforcement. News choppers from multiple networks, drawn by growing reports of something unprecedented unfolding in Chicago's heart. The media response is larger than expected, Morrison observed, checking updates. Not just local coverage, national networks, international press, because they received more than just anonymous tips, Chase explained. They got comprehensive evidence packages, Documentation of corruption that spans continents, proof that can't be denied or buried. Through the office windows, they could see the gathering crowd transforming. What had started as curious onlookers was becoming something else. People, emerging from shadows, revealing hidden capabilities, demonstrating years of careful preparation. Your network, not Blackwood said slowly, understanding dawning. It's not just about gathering evidence. You've created something entirely new. A shadow organization dedicated to exposing corruption rather than protecting it. Interesting choice of words, Chase replied, his mild manner carrying new weight, though I prefer to think of it as a movement. People from all walks of life, united by the understanding that corruption can only thrive in darkness. Sarah's camera continued documenting everything, but her movements suggested more than just photographic interest. She was recording specific details, faces in the crowd, tactical positions, the way seemingly ordinary citizens were coordinating with professional precision. The Ghost Brigade's greatest weakness, Chase continued, was believing that power comes from operating in shadows, from controlling information, manipulating narratives, enforcing silence. His smile carried years of patient planning. They never understood that shadows can work both ways. Catherine's equipment detected new patterns of communication, not military or official channels, but something more subtle. Civilian frequencies were used in sophisticated ways, carrying coded messages that spoke of long preparation and careful coordination. Your people aren't just observers, she noted, professional appreciation evident. They've created their own communication networks, ways of sharing information that bypass official channels. Because sometimes the best way to fight corruption, Chase agreed, is to build something entirely new. Systems that can't be compromised because they operate outside official control. Through the building's security systems, they could see the basement confrontation evolving. The professional teams weren't just fighting anymore. They were discovering that their opponents included civilians with surprising levels of tactical knowledge. People who had learned military operations from the inside, who understood how to counter official protocols. 5 years, not Blackwood mused, pieces finally clicking together. Not just gathering evidence, but building something larger. Training people, establishing networks, preparing for this moment. Because the best weapon against systemic corruption, Chase replied, isn't just exposing individual crimes, it's creating systems that make corruption impossible to maintain. Networks of truth that can't be intimidated or controlled. Morrison studied the gathering crowd with new understanding. Among the seemingly random faces, he could now see patterns emerging, people moving with tactical awareness, coordinating movements in ways that suggested military training. Your network includes former law enforcement, he observed. People who walked away from corrupt departments, who kept watching, gathering evidence. People who understood that sometimes the best way to serve justice, Chase confirmed, is to step outside official channels, to build something new, something that can't be compromised by power or money. The printing presses below had taken on a different rhythm now, their thunder carrying through the building's foundations. But they weren't just printing newspapers anymore. They were recording the emergence of something unprecedented, a network of truth seekers and justice defenders, united by the understanding that corruption can only be fought through coordinated exposure. Catherine's equipment continued monitoring encrypted communications, tracking the desperate attempts of various organizations to contain the situation. But each transmission just revealed more connections, exposed more layers of corruption, and demonstrated how deeply the rot had penetrated legitimate institutions. They still think they can control this, she observed, studying the data. Still believe they can maintain their systems of power. Because they don't understand what's really happening, Chase replied. This isn't just about exposing crimes or revealing corruption. It's about transforming how power itself operates, creating something new, a system where truth becomes more powerful than any weapon. The game wasn't just changing, it was becoming something entirely different. And as more people emerged from shadows, as corrupt systems discovered their power evaporating, as networks of truth seekers coordinated their revelations, everyone involved began to realize that tonight would determine not just who survived, but what kind of world would emerge from this crucible of revelation and justice. A world where the most dangerous operatives weren't the ones carrying badges or guns, but the ones who had spent years gathering evidence, building networks, preparing to expose corruption in ways that no amount of power could suppress. A world where truth itself became the ultimate weapon, wielded not by official authorities, but by networks of dedicated individuals united in their commitment to justice. The first explosions weren't from weapons. They came from the implosion of secrets, detonating across encrypted networks, shattering firewalls once thought impenetrable. The digital floodgates had opened. Files long buried under layers of bureaucracy and obfuscation were surfacing in real time, spilling out into secure drop points across the world. Documents detailing illegal arms deals, covert assassinations, black-budget projects, all now irreversibly public. The world was watching. Chase stood in the control center of the Herald, watching the ripple effect unfold through Catherine's monitors. International news networks were scrambling, trying to verify the avalanche of evidence pouring onto their desks. Governments, corporations, intelligence agencies, none of them had expected the network of truth seekers to be this effective. They had spent years covering their tracks, but now every lie was being peeled back layer by layer. The response teams are fracturing, Morrison reported, eyes locked on the tactical feed. Some are holding their ground, others are standing. Down, more are switching sides. Not Blackwood clenched his fists, a rare display of emotion breaking through his practiced composure. You don't understand what you're unleashing. Stability exists because of people like us. We built a world that works, however imperfectly. No, Chase countered. You built a world that served the powerful at the expense of everyone else. You kept it together with secrecy and fear. But now people can see the full picture, and the moment they see it, they start asking questions. Outside, the gathering crowd wasn't just watching anymore. It was mobilizing. Voices rose, a groundswell of awareness, becoming something more. Protesters clashed with security teams that had been deployed to protect compromised assets. Street-level operatives were confronting their handlers. Some former enforcers were disappearing into the night, their allegiances uncertain. Others turned themselves in, knowing that the game had changed for good. International signals are lighting up, Catherine called from her station. Leaders are scrambling. Some are denying everything, others are going silent, and some are already making moves to secure themselves. They always think they can run, Sarah murmured, snapping another photo through the window, until they realize there's nowhere left to go. In the basement, the last of the fighting had ended. The former Ghost Brigade operatives who had defected were now coordinating with federal agents who had arrived in force. The ones who had stayed loyal to the old order were in cuffs, their fates now left to a legal system that, for once, would be forced to act in the face of overwhelming public scrutiny. Morrison's radio crackled again. You need to see this. A feed popped onto the main screen, a live press conference hastily arranged in Washington. A senior official, his face drawn and pale, was addressing the nation. In light of the revelations that have come to light tonight, the administration is launching an independent investigation into the allegations of corruption, illegal military activity, and international crimes. Effective immediately, key officials from multiple agencies will be placed under review. We urge our allies and partners across the world to assist in uncovering the full extent of these networks. The questions from the press corps were immediate, shouted over one another. The official flinched, knowing that no answer he could give would satisfy the tide that had just turned. Chase exhaled. And there it is, the first real crack in the armor. Not Blackwood's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen but didn't answer. He already knew what the message would say. The network he had spent a lifetime building was dissolving before his eyes. Sarah lowered her camera. The world's going to a change, isn't it? Chase nodded. Not overnight, not completely, but enough. Enough that they won't be able to rebuild the same way again. Enough that people will finally see what was hidden in the dark. Catherine's equipment detected another transmission. The last remnants of the Ghost Brigade were scattering, but they weren't fighting anymore. They were disappearing, their leaders already thinking about how to survive in the new world they had never imagined would come. They'll try again, Morrison warned. People like them always do. And when they do, we'll be ready, Chase said. Simply, below, the presses continued to thunder, printing the truth for the first time, without fear, and outside the crowd surged forward, no longer just spectators, but participants in a world that would never be the same again. The ripples of that night extended far beyond Chicago. Across the world, other truth-seekers followed suit. Leaks emerged in Berlin, in Tokyo, in Johannesburg, in São Paulo. Governments were forced to respond, to address the undeniable evidence surfacing in real time. Old power structures crumbled while new alliances formed among those determined to ensure accountability. A week later, Chase sat in a dimly lit room, surrounded by others who had worked in the shadows for years, each playing their part in the grander plan. A map of the world stretched across the table, covered in red markings where the truth had already struck. Sarah placed her camera down, looking at Chase. This was just the beginning, wasn't it? Chase's expression was unreadable, but his voice carried certainty. The beginning of something they never saw coming, the end of the old game, and the start of a new one where the truth is the most dangerous weapon of all. The door opened, and Catherine walked in with fresh intelligence reports. New targets, new leaks. The next phase is already unfolding. Chase looked around. The room. Then let's get to work. The war against corruption had entered a new era. One where no secret could remain buried for long, and no empire of lies would ever feel safe again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.